Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wait, What? Why? The podcast that ponders the origins of why we do the things that we do. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. In this episode, we are discussing the origins of Thanksgiving. I'm Nicole Gallagher, your host, and I would love to introduce my oldest daughter, Megan Gallagher is here with us today for this episode. Thank you for joining me today.
Of course.
I'm very excited to have you here. And I guess we should just talk a little bit about Thanksgiving first.
Yeah. Okay. So we are going to talk about the origins of Thanksgiving. But first, I wanted to just, talk about just fun Thanksgiving memories and stuff that we do, because I just thought that would be a good way to get the ball rolling.
It would be. And I also want to say that this show is going to be very unique from all the other shows because Megan is doing the research and I'm just going to be the lovely personality who ad-libs along the way. So I haven't done any research on this episode. Of course, I know the traditional history behind Thanksgiving, but I haven't done anything. So Megan's going to take the lead role in this episode.
Yeah, and this is actually a fun fact. I know you guys are used to my dad and like him and mom and their banter, but when this podcast was originally conceived,
True,
I was supposed to be the co-host. So if you end up liking it more or less, you don't actually have to tell us. It doesn't matter because it is what it is. But that's why I wanted to research, was because I felt like I had to make it up.
That was the original idea. So the original idea was I always wanted to do a podcast. Megan and I both love podcasts. And she was like, all right, I'll do the research. You can, be the other person. I was like, okay. And then she has a lot going on in her life and it was a big undertaking. So I convinced my lovely husband to do it with me. And
I think it worked out. You guys are great. I think you guys because my mom actually has me beta listen to all of the podcast episodes so far. So just to give her advice, because like she said, I love podcasts, so I know a lot about them and how they should flow. And I love it. I love the banter. It's great. So
Thank you. I also think you're a little biased because
I am, because I think that too, as a beta listener, I'm super biased because it kind of feels like I'm sitting in on a family conversation as opposed to a stranger.
Family gets family humor, which is my biggest fear when this podcast goes out into the world, is that we think we're hysterical and no one else does.
Well, people think I'm funny out in the world, but sometimes I can't tell if they're laughing with me or at me.
Yeah,
but
I get that.
You know what? It doesn't matter. If you guys laugh with or at us, you're laughing, and that's all that matters.
It's true. I like that. And that's that's lovely. I like that. Let's go with that.
Okay. Do you have any fun Thanksgiving memories, either predating me or with me?
All right. Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was not my favorite holiday. I did like the family gatherings and the warm fuzzy feeling with having everyone around and, the coffee and desserts and the people and the parade on the TV and the football in the background and all that kind of stuff. So,
did you guys get together with your cousins or anything?
We didn't, because we were closest with my mother's family, but they were all in New York.
Yeah, I remember now.
And my father's side of the family wasn't very close at all. So my mom had a best friend, Pam, who we called Aunt Pam, but she wasn't related by blood. She was my Aunt Pam. So that's why I was saying I was confusing Thanksgiving with Easter, because we got together a lot for those family things. But I think it was more so for Easter than it was for Thanksgiving.
Yeah. That's really funny when I think about my Thanksgiving experience, because when you had my sisters and I, we usually had Thanksgiving, from what I remember, at your brother's, at my uncle's.
Right.
And it was a party. He had a bunch of people over, family and friends. And So every year we would end up driving there and having like a family dinner, but it was buffet style.
Yes.
And like football would always be on the TV, and I'd get to see these people that I only ever saw like twice a year because he also had parties on the 4th of July.
Mm-hmm.
So it was the 4th of July and Thanksgiving were when I would like see my mom's, well, let me try again. Your side of the family.
Right.
Yeah, yes. So it would be like all of your side of the family that we would see. And we had dinner at my uncle's. I call him my funkle.
He's a fun uncle.
That is why. But yeah, so we would eat at my funkle's, and then we'd have dessert at my grandma's.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, we had dessert at my grandma's.
Yeah.
Well, usually I'd sneak some dessert at Funkle's, and then I'd also eat dessert at my grandmother's.
So yeah, my sister-in-law's side of the family is huge. She has a ton of siblings, so it was a really big family gathering.
It was super fun.
Yeah, like it was a lot of fun.
As a young kid, that was a blast all the time. And there were plenty of other kids for me to play with.
There were.
So yeah, great memories. And then even... Oh, I have a fun one.
Okay.
This was way more recent. This was my freshman year of college.
Okay.
I wasn't home for Thanksgiving.
It was terrible. It was heartbreaking.
Well, the reason why wasn't like anything tragic.
No.
It was because I'm in the marching band and we were performing at the Dunkin' Donuts parade in Philadelphia.
Right.
So that is like the stepping stone to the Macy's Day Parade. That's like the second biggest, and that was in Philly. And
pre-COVID.
It was
the year before COVID. Yeah.
And so we got to go there as the marching band, and I remember we arrived there, and we like spent the day or the night in Philly because we arrived there in the day, and then in the morning we like got up super early. We performed in the parade, and then we got on a bus and drove like however many hours it took to get to New Jersey. And then I had Thanksgiving dinner in a Holiday Inn. No, I stayed in a Holiday Inn, and I had Thanksgiving dinner in a Cuban restaurant adjacent to the Holiday Inn instead of with my family. So you think that it was tragic. I was really suffering because I was eating Thanksgiving dinner at a Cuban restaurant. Like, it was terrible. And we were the only people there. Like, the restaurant was clearly closed down or something.
Right.
For our private event. And I think the only dessert was, like, rice pudding.
Oh, no. That's so disappointing.
It's fine. Like, rice pudding's fine.
No, it's not.
It's
not for Thanksgiving. It's fine if you're in a nursing home and you're 80 years old.
And it just, I don't know, it took us all forever to, like, eat. And some of us were dressed up and some of us weren't. And, like, oh man, no. It was tragic. But when I got back, you guys had saved me plenty of leftovers.
Yeah, we did.
So that was nice. But yeah, I wanted to talk about that because that is by far the most...
And it was sad for me because I was missing one of my children.
Yeah, it was actually funny. I made a meme out of a photo of you and Cameron.
So this is just coming out on this podcast right now?
It was you and Cameron at Thanks, and you guys were like hugging in the dining room.
Oh, and Hannah was.
Hannah was like off to the side just like glaring daggers at you for some reason. And I like made it a meme like my family having Thanksgiving, me eating dinner at a Cuban restaurant in Philadelphia. No, in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that was funny. So, the origins of Thanksgiving. I'm sure that you have heard a lot of this, and I have very detailed notes. I don't know how detailed we're going to go, but this is it, the origin of Thanksgiving. So, in September of 1692, a ship known as the Mayflower carried 102 settlers, who we now know are the Pilgrims, from Plymouth, England to Massachusetts. Of that 102, 35 of them were Puritans who had broken from the Church of England. And it was actually kind of interesting because they had already settled in the Netherlands before moving to America. And the only reason why they left the Netherlands was because they were afraid that they would lose that English heritage and language. I don't know. Just
that's interesting. Yeah, that's a fun fact.
Yeah. Like we knew about the Puritans, but I didn't know that. So it was a pretty rough journey from England to America because it took about 2 months.
No,
of
seasickness. Without Dramamine, forget it. I would be a mess.
Me too. And, they're just surviving on, like, that time's equivalent of whatever you can, like, pickle or whatever.
Gross.
I know. And unfortunately for them, due to rough seas and inclement weather, they didn't actually end up where they wanted to end up and had to set anchor at Plymouth Harbor, which is the modern-day Cape Cod. And then they ended up moving again a month later to actual Plymouth.
Plymouth Rock.
Yes. But they first touched down at Cape Cod. That's true. Yeah.
So did they get off the boat in Cape Cod?
Yeah, and they were like, this isn't where we're supposed to be.
So what's the significance of Plymouth Rock then?
That's where they ended up being, was in Plymouth.
But it wasn't, like, Plymouth Rock is supposed to be the first step of the Pilgrims off the boat onto their settlement.
I think you're going to find that a lot of the history that you know isn't really true.
All right, so I'm just going to take a little sidebar here. As a child growing up in Massachusetts, we had field trips to Plymouth Rock. And if any of our listeners have never been to Plymouth Rock, it's very disappointing when you go there. It's literally this little tiny rock. It's like roped off and it has like a plaque. And you expect this like giant boulder that they stepped out onto with their boots and their fancy English wear. And they're like, we have arrived. And it's not. It's this tiny little rock. And it's very disappointing to see.
That's so weird. Like, did it used to be bigger and then
maybe
like
erosion?
Yeah, I was gonna
erosion.
Say, it could
maybe
be erosion. It could be
know.
Rising tides. But so yeah.
So they arrived at the Cape first,
yes,
and then moved to Plymouth, which really isn't like
It's not that far at all.
It's not. So why were they like?
Well, the point is that I don't know why they moved, but the point I was making was that they ended up not going where they'd intended to go. Mm-hmm. They just didn't intend to be that far north at all.
Okay.
They were actually trying to get to the already established settlement in Jamestown, Virginia.
Okay.
But I think they just said due to rough seas and inclement weather and whatever else, they ended up in Massachusetts and they ended up staying there. The Pilgrims, when they landed, they intended to be in Jamestown, but they totally weren't, and they found themselves without any support, and they'd been really depending on the other settlers' support. But they were just on their own, and that winter, half of the Pilgrims ended up dying. Yeah, so unfortunately, half the Pilgrims did not make it, mostly due to poor nutrition and inadequate housing. I did hear that they were living out of the Mayflower for like the first month or so that they were there, just like
sense.
Ferrying supplies back and forth. And it was December when they arrived, so it was rough.
It's the worst time to arrive in Massachusetts, I'll tell you what.
I know, especially since, well, I had heard, I was going to say, I was listening to a podcast episode of another podcast that was addressing like the myth about how much drinking water people need in a day. And they were talking about how before we had our clean water technology, they always mixed their water with alcohol. And that on the Mayflower, they had water that they'd mixed with beer. And that when the crew of the Mayflower touched down, like in Plymouth, and
on the rock.
No. and the Pilgrims like settled, and were settling, the crew of the Mayflower did not let them have any more of the beer or take any of the beer because they were trying to save it for the return trip. So on top of all the other things that the Pilgrims had going on, they also had to drink water, just straight water, which was pretty much a death sentence in like England. Because they didn't know how to clean water. They just knew to mix it with alcohol. They didn't have any alcohol when they settled in America. So I bet that when they say poor nutrition was one of the causes, it might have also been some sort of
bacteria-filled water
illness
source.
Related to not knowing how to get their own clean water. So yeah, that's interesting. And the podcast that I was listening to, by the way, was called Body Stuff. If anyone's interested. It was a very interesting episode. So, clearly, the Pilgrims needed help. They were having a rough go. But lucky for them, they weren't alone. There have been people in the Americas before European settlers came for at least 12,000 years.
No way. No. We weren't the first people here?
And for the Pilgrims, the people that lived in the area that they were settling were the Wampanoag, who had actually, just before the Pilgrims arrived, they'd been hit pretty hard by a plague, which is, interestingly, the only reason why Plymouth was even, abandoned. The only reason why there was room for them to move in was because the tribe that was living there just was, kind of decimated by this plague just a year before, or a couple years before, so there was plenty of room for the settlers when they came from Europe, but, they had no way of knowing that.
So it wasn't the Pilgrims who brought the plague.
No. It was a different plague. Lots of plagues throughout history,
Lots
folks.
of plagues. We just lived through a pandemic, so yeah, this is just another one. But, however, I say Wampanoags.
Is that right?
That's how I grew up, but I grew up in Massachusetts, so we say a lot of things weird.
I didn't look it up.
I think it's a Wampanoag. The Wampanoag tribe. So we just researched the pronunciation of Wampanoag, and we had Google Translation saying it was Wampanoag.
Which is what I was saying.
And then this old man on some site saying Wampanoag. So however it is you say it, we're talking about the same thing. That's all.
Yes, we're talking about the same people. The Pilgrims weren't alone. Also living there were the Wampanoag. Since they had just been weakened by this plague that had occurred a couple years before, they weren't that strong. They had a lot less of them than they normally had, and they were worried about potentially one of the other rival tribes in the area taking advantage of the fact that they were in a weakened state.
Right, yeah.
So when they saw the Pilgrims had moved in, they saw it as an opportunity.
A sign, if you will.
Political opportunity.
Ooh, savvy.
Mm-hmm. So they were thinking if they formed an alliance with the Pilgrims, then that would discourage their rivals from attacking them. And the reason why is because Europeans they had their priorities a lot differently they had a lot of different priorities than the Native Americans. And they were willing to trade steel blades like knives and axes for beaver pelts.
Right.
And to the Native Americans, beaver pelts were the most easy thing you could possibly come across.
Plentiful.
I saw one article that said it was like someone saying they'd give you gold for rocks.
Right.
Like you could just give them a rock.
Right.
So they were very...
I have a ton of beaver pelts hanging out in the back here.
Yeah.
But I don't have any steel blades.
Exactly.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so they were very valued trading partners.
Yes.
And the Wampanoag were hoping that by forming an alliance, their rivals wouldn't attack them for fear of disrupting their trade with the Europeans.
Plus, now they have weapons.
Yeah, I mean, they have more sophisticated weapons than they'd previously had. Which was awesome for them. And yeah, so the way that they put together and orchestrated their alliance was through the already English-speaking members of the Wampanoag. So there were 2 members who had already been to England and back because they had entered the slave trade and then escaped it and were able to come back home. And so they spoke English, and they were able to...
Mind blown.
I know. Well, I remember hearing in school that that some of them could speak English, but it was never explained to me why. They were just they'd been to England, and I was like, oh, that's a really cool opportunity.
I don't think I ever heard that.
Yeah. And that's true because, and when the Pilgrims touched down, it wasn't like there wasn't already an established relationship between Europeans and Native Americans. Like, there was already some tensions, but again, the Wampanoag were willing to make an alliance based on, like, trading and trust, and it ended up
trying to intimidate their rivals.
Yep.
Okay.
So, yeah, with the help of those English-speaking members, the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims established a peace treaty that ended up lasting 50 years. To my knowledge, that was the first of its kind that I could find.
Interesting.
And some of the articles that I was reading said that peace treaty, in a lot of ways, is more revolutionary than the feast that would follow. Because it was,
because of the first of its kind, lasting 50. It was an alliance.
Yep.
Basically, it was the beginning of an alliance.
Yeah. And so with that alliance formed, the Wampanoag showed the Pilgrims how to plant corn, where to fish and hunt. And with that, we get to the first Thanksgiving.
And now, I love Thanksgiving in my adult life. So, I don't think that the foods that we eat are the same as the foods that they ate in the early times.
No, totally not.
However, they are delicious.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I will share that at that first feast, you know what?
Wait a minute. No, all right. So, question.
Yes.
No turkeys.
It is unclear as to whether or not turkey was at that feast.
The main bird was pheasant.
I don't remember there being a bird actually at all. Like, I didn't see...
Really? What is it, deer?
Yes, there were deer that the Wampanoag had actually brought. And then...
I'm assuming corn, squash. That's all I got. Corn, squash, deer. What other kind of gamey thing do we have on the coast? Do they have seafood?
I have it.
Fish?
So, it does say that they had fowl. It says fowling.
Fowl. That it's a bird.
I was going to say, so you're right, there were birds.
But we don't know what kind of bird.
And then they said that there was deer too. All right, so we do have a list of some of the things that they did have at the meal. Lobster, seal, and swans were on the menu.
Ew! Swans?
What do you mean, ew? That was what they had to eat.
Gross.
They didn't have our luxuries now.
They're
beautiful.
Uh-huh.
And then they also had fowling, bass, and corn.
I knew they would have seafood.
Yeah.
Well, they're on the
they
coast.
They had seal and swan.
Oh, barf. Sorry. That's gross.
Yeah, don't judge them, Mom.
That's very fatty. We're not in Alaska. We're in
They were working with what they had.
All right. It's like whale blubber.
Massachusetts then looked a lot different than it does
I'm
now.
Sure.
So, speaking of the first Thanksgiving, I did want to tell you something that is kind of confusing, but you'll have to bear with me.
All right, I'm listening.
It wasn't really a Thanksgiving, per se.
They weren't thankful?
So they were, but for European settlers, for Europeans in general, they already had something that they called a Thanksgiving that had been around for like years before they ever even came to America. So the traditional European Thanksgiving didn't even involve feasting. It was like a fasting and prayer sort of not celebration, sort of event where you wouldn't eat, it was fasting and it was like all about God and thanking God.
Did this happen in November?
No, it was just a thing that they would do. It was an event. Like, it was known that you would have them, like, in times of like, wanting to show your gratitude, but it had never really been celebrated the way that they were celebrating it at Plymouth, where they were having a celebration because of the harvest. Because the previous year, half of them had died, and then this year, with the Wampanoag's help, they had an awesome harvest. They were hunting a lot better, and they wanted to have a celebration. But yeah, so like, it's just a fun fact that Thanksgivings have been celebrated for like ever in England before they ever came to America.
But it wasn't thanks for Thanksgiving.
It was, but it was just different. They were giving thanks is what it was. And because for them it was supposed to be prayer and fasting, they didn't mention any of that, like in the letters that they were able to find documenting the original feast. They couldn't actually find anything about that. So it wasn't a traditional Thanksgiving, but when the letter was published, because in 1841, a publisher in Boston printed a book that contained the letter that didn't mention prayer or fasting anywhere in it from the original Thanksgiving. But when he published the letter, he called it the first Thanksgiving in a footnote, and people just took that and ran with it later.
I like it.
Yeah. So yeah, that's true. And then this is also very controversial. It wasn't even the first Thanksgiving in America.
Okay, bring it.
It was the first of its kind, but there has been evidence that has surfaced that the first Thanksgiving in America actually occurred 2 years before in Virginia, where a group of religious-minded settlers celebrated with prayer their voyage from England in December 1619, and that was the first thing that they did when they got there. They celebrated a traditional European Thanksgiving. So while the Thanksgiving at Plymouth is the first Thanksgiving... Feasting. Yeah, it's the first Thanksgiving as we sort of know it now.
Right.
It wasn't technically the first Thanksgiving. Just letting you guys know. So, like, lots of things, myths being broken now. But yeah, so the Wampanoag did end up being at that feast, and it's kind of, funny the reason why. It was because they heard the gunshots from the pilgrims who were going hunting for the feast, and they got a little nervous, like, oh no, are they going to break the peace treaty? So they said like 90 members of the tribe showed up and were, a little worried, like, hey, what's going on? And they were like, oh, we're throwing a harvest feast. You guys want in? So they, like, brought deer, and they brought corn, and
they're, like, telling their little, Wampanoag wives, like, quick, you need to make a casserole. We got to go to a feast.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Just putting everyone in a frenzy.
That wasn't how it worked. But, yeah, so they ended up feasting together, and as cool as that is, a lot of people say the peace treaty that led to that was even cooler.
It is very cool.
Yeah. And then, very briefly, I'll address how Thanksgiving came to now.
Well, let's do that because I have some questions, but I feel like you're going to answer them.
Okay.
In this.
Okay.
Okay.
I want to hear your question.
Well, you might answer them in your little speech right now.
Okay. So, that happened in the 1600s. That's when all of that happened. But it wasn't until 1769 when it says a group of Pilgrim descendants who lived in Plymouth felt like their cultural authority was being lost because New England was becoming less relevant within the colonies as they all were being settled, and they wanted everybody to recognize them as the original settlers, which they weren't. It was Virginia.
Right.
But they wanted that authority. So they started to plant the seeds of this idea that the Pilgrims were the fathers of America, and that was kind of to boost tourism and to help with their authority.
Hence Plymouth Rock.
That
tiny little
a tourist attraction
boulder.
That it kind of makes sense that it's so disappointing because I couldn't even find anything that says it was real. It could have just been a myth about tourism. Sorry to anyone who feels strongly about Plymouth Rock out there.
Well, if anyone has seen it, they don't feel that strongly about it.
And then there was a little bit more. It picked up again in the 19th century because there were some changing racial politics where they were, having these terrible wars with the Native Americans just previous, and then that was coming to a close. So a lot of people saw it as a good time to have the Native Americans included in a national founding myth, which they couldn't really do before. Nobody was talking about it while they were in the midst of the war. But now that the war is over, they wanted to include that and talk about that more. And so, yeah, that is just cool. That's how it's been able to continue.
Withstand time.
Yeah, withstand time. Like, yes. It had some fluctuations, but it was coming back. And then, I kind of skipped this, but George Washington did issue the first Thanksgiving proclamation in 1789, in which he called upon Americans to express their gratitude for the happy conclusion to the War of Independence.
That kind of led me to a question, not for you necessarily, but to our listeners. Because in our Thanksgiving, we do celebrate Thanksgiving. We do have a bunch of family over our house, and we have a ginormous feast with lots of goodies. But we don't necessarily say, like, give gratitude or say what we're thankful for.
Yeah, well, and that's actually, I was going to talk about Thanksgiving traditions.
See?
Yeah, because there are a lot of different ones.
I know.
And that might actually have to be another episode some other time. Luckily for you guys.
You might get a bonus with Megan. Stay tuned, listeners.
All right. Oh, yeah. So how I said in the 19th century, it was really picking up.
Yeah.
This was a fun fact. In 1817, New York became the first of several states to officially adopt an annual Thanksgiving holiday, but everyone kind of just celebrated it on a different day, and the American South just didn't care. Like, they didn't even know it existed. Mm-hmm. It was basically just a northern thing.
Right, I get that.
And then 10 years later, in 1827, there was a noted magazine editor and writer named Sarah Josepha Hale. Is that how you pronounce that? Josepha?
Yeah, Josepha. Yeah.
And she was an author of the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb.
Get out of town.
Yeah, and she also was the one who launched the campaign to establish Thanksgiving as a national holiday. And for 36 years, she published numerous editorials and sent scores of letters to everyone she could, just to get them to heed her request.
So a woman.
Yep.
In the early 1800s.
Yep.
Pushing
for Thanksgiving.
Yeah. Go get it.
And then it was Abraham Lincoln who finally, in 1863, wrote a proclamation entreating all Americans to ask God to commend his care to all those who had suffered during the Civil War, and scheduled Thanksgiving, which is when you were supposed to give that thanks, for the final Thursday in November. And it was celebrated every year until 1939, when Franklin D. Roosevelt moved it up a week in an attempt to spur retail sales during the Great Depression.
Oh, commercialism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Terrible.
So that's when it is today.
So that was...
Well, that's not true, actually. That was a total lie. So he moved it up. Sorry. He moved it up, and then it says his plan was known as Franksgiving for some reason.
Who?
Roosevelt.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
He changed it to Franksgiving.
He wanted to be named after him?
Yeah.
Ugh.
And then everybody hated it. So yeah, that
Franksgiving
was a total flop. And in 1941, he signed a bill making Thanksgiving the fourth Thursday of November.
So. Well, I do like that. I hate Franksgiving. I love that Josepha Hale pushed for this. But it took 30 years.
It's because of her
30 years before
36.
Lincoln?
Yep.
Noticed this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was because of her efforts that she is now known as the mother of Thanksgiving.
Aw.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, it's really cool. And, even though the history of Thanksgiving is, not necessarily taught that accurately, if, any parents out there want to make sure that their kids are getting the real deal instead of the, stuff we were taught in school, which involves
It's
Plymouth
just
Rock
glossed.
and-
It's glossed over. It's like Columbus. Megan and I were talking about this earlier, but like everything's like glossed over to be like this quick, simple, and this is what happened. And the Indians and the, Europeans made friends and they had a feast together.
And nothing bad ever happened. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of American history that has to do with Native Americans it's not necessarily a lie, but it kind of is because it's totally glossed over.
Totally.
But I found a really good article for like Nat Geo Kids that explains it in a way that I think kids can really grasp. And we're going to put that in the description.
Yes.
In the show notes so that you guys, if anyone's interested, wants to see a very simple way that you can do that and explain that, then yeah, it's going to be there.
All the sources are always in the podcast description on our website. You can always find them there. And double check us.
None of my sources are Nat Geo Kids, but because I found it, I decided that I would include it. But yeah, so that is the history of Thanksgiving as we know it.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, you guys are welcome.
I love it. I learned, because I do not teach early, American history. I teach world history and geography, but so a lot of that stuff I didn't know the little minute details of. So I learned a lot today. So we learned the history of Thanksgiving. We learned about our woman, Sarah Josepha Hale really pushed for Thanksgiving in her media outlet, which is, I think, huge.
We learned about
Franksgiving, which is horrifying in and of itself.
Terrible.
But I love that you came to help us out today, especially because we were supposed to be the dynamic duo.
We were, so
yes.
Yeah, I don't know. This is exciting. I like this.
So maybe you can come back to do a little bonus episode about
whatever.
No, well, that too.
Anything.
But you were talking about like the traditions, of Thanksgiving and prayer saying.
Yeah, plenty of that
giving
stuff.
Thanks and
plenty of that stuff we couldn't even touch on today.
Right. So in the meantime, if you have any stories that you would like to share, or your traditions that you do in your family, or any false stories that you might have been told in school growing up, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at waitwhatwhypod@gmail.com. That's all lowercase, all one word, waitwhatwhypod@gmail.com. Anything else you want to add?
No, just please always write in and share the podcast with your friends.
Always.
And anyone interested remotely, because we're or mom, not me. I'm not, this is a one shot for now. But yeah, no, my parents are working pretty hard on this, especially my mom. So if you like it, just, share it and rate it and all those good things.
All those good things. All right. So thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us today. We absolutely appreciate you all. During this month, we will continue to dive into some origins that happen around Thanksgiving. So, I'm hoping for a bonus episode. I'm not going to give you any sneak peeks into that, but please let us know, again, your stories, your traditions, your questions at waitwhatwhypod@gmail.com. I'd like to give a big shout out to Francis for our podcast artwork. You can check out our website, and please remember to subscribe, leave a review, and tell a friend. See you next time.
Bye, guys.